in Berlin, especially all your students, very welcome here to this session. As you know, it's typically the co-curricular events, conferences like this, that can have a wonderful impact on your intellectual life, and who knows, some of you might decide after Dr. Wade's talk that it's really necessary that you now take the next step and move to Europe for a year or a summer and continue the conversations that we begin today. Let me also quickly announce, after this session, there will be a ceremony at the UND Eternal Flame at 3:15. Let's hope the weather will hold up. And as you probably are aware, at 7 p.m. in our Chester Fritz Auditorium, there is a conversation with Ted Sorensen starting at 7 p.m., followed by a reception at our North Dakota Museum of Art, where there's also book signing, and the Chris Tansey Collective will provide music. It's a great privilege to welcome Dr. Robert Wade to our conference. Dr. Wade studied at the universities of Würzburg and Munich before completing his PhD in modern European history at the State University of New York at Binghamton. He has taught for the University of Maryland's European Division, for Idaho State University and Boise State University. Recently, he left the Department of Justice after 20 years as a senior historian in their Office of Special Investigations, the unit that investigated and brought to court individuals in the U.S. who had aided the Nazis during the Holocaust. Dr. Wade has published widely, including books on Frank Lloyd Wright, on Ezra Pound, on Joe Albertson, a supermarket magnate, and he is contributing editor to the Encyclopedia of World War II. Recent articles include works on abortion in Nazi Germany as a law enforcement issue, on teenage sexuality in Nazi Germany, on anti-Semitism in German legal writings, on violent crime in the Western Frontier, and other wide-ranging topics. He's currently working on a book on teenage opposition and resistance in Nazi Germany. And in spring '09, Dr. Wade will be based at the Memorial Site for German Resistance in Berlin. It's a great pleasure to welcome him to our conference. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wade. By the way, his presentation will consist of two parts. Part one, where we will hear about the context, the Cold War of JFK's famous visit to Berlin, is entitled JFK, Berlin, and the Berlin Crises, 1961 to 63. This part will be followed by a brief break, where you are invited to ask questions, comments, and so on.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's certainly a privilege to be here back in the West. Whereas Olaf noted, I spent a number of years in Idaho. And it's also very nice to have students here, because I remember when I was an undergraduate going to hear lectures like this and thinking, there's no way that I'll ever do that. Little did I know, only a few years later, I began spending what turned out to be more than 5 years in Germany, having worked in several dozen archives in Germany, the Baltic states, Slovakia, Britain, and unlike my distinguished colleagues who had the opportunity to work in presidential libraries and archives, which are wonderful, clean places. I remember one time once working in a prison in Hamburg, Germany, the screaming and yelling and looking out, and the prisoners are hanging out the window and things. And another time I was working in the prison, all of a sudden it got real quiet, and I got locked in. It was a prison as a museum. It scared the heck out of me. And finally I had to trigger an alarm, and the alarm people thought it was hilarious. Some guy gets locked into the prison. I said, let me out of here. In any case, JFK and the Berlin crisis. When John Kennedy took the office of oath of office on January the 20th, 1961, he had nothing to say in his inaugural address about Berlin, about the ongoing crisis over the status of the divided city. Despite the absence of references to Berlin in his initial address as president, JFK had to focus on Berlin from the time of his election on November 8th to his swearing in, because a crisis in Berlin could erupt at any time, precipitated by the mercurial Nikita Khrushchev, Premier of the Soviet Union, or the ruthless leader of East Germany, Walter Ulbricht. In fact, tensions over the divided city mounted, and the Berlin question became one of the defining issues of his presidency. This paper, which I'll give you now, examines JFK in Berlin, his views of the divided city, the quick summary of the ongoing crisis is precipitated by Khrushchev, who termed, he had a very earthly way of describing things, he termed Berlin the testicles of the West, thinking that just to get the West's attention on issues, they just had to twist a little bit like that. In any case, the American president developed a special relationship with Berlin that culminated in his June 1963 visit. Throughout, JFK used the public forum, speeches, news conferences, television broadcasts, to shape the crisis over Berlin, to send sometimes conflicting messages, sometimes straightforward messages to the American people. His messages also went to the people of West Berlin, East Germany, and the Kremlin. The whole world was listening. He had a multitude of audience there. Now, the way that JFK handled the ongoing crisis over Berlin, the manner in which he responded to East German and Soviet challenges, the words of his speeches and television addresses, his very public art of diplomacy, and historic visit to West Berlin in June 1963 reveal much about his leadership, I think, his style of governing, and his effectiveness as President of the United States. Now, by way of background, Berlin had been a source of contention between the Western Allies, Britain, France, and the United States, and the Soviet Union since the end of the Second World War, when agreements divided the city deep in East German territory in the zones of occupation. Berlin rests several hundred kilometers behind the border within the Soviet zone. Now, as East-West tensions mounted, the importance of Berlin as a trouble spot grew. In November 1958, Soviet Premier Khrushchev rattled the nerves of President Eisenhower and the Western powers when he told a Moscow audience that he was ready to turn over its functions in Berlin to East Germany. East Germany's leader, Walter Ulbricht, took that and spoke up, announcing that the Soviets would formally declare their intention to withdraw from East Berlin by the end of November. Then he asserted the Western powers would have to come to terms with the East German regime if they mean to stay in Berlin, something the Western powers did not want to do. Now, only a couple of weeks later, Khrushchev spoke again, giving the Western powers 6 months to act. His position shifted continuously. His words were received with shock and rejection, the New York Times reported, because the Western powers are solemnly committed to stay in Berlin and to defend it at all costs until there is a solution to the whole German problem. They cannot retreat from that solemn commitment without giving a death blow, not only to free West Berlin, but also to free Germany and free Europe. Gives you an idea of the sense of importance that Berlin was assuming. A day later, in late November 58, Soviet authorities said the 6-month limit was flexible, and that the transfer of its responsibilities in Berlin to the East German regime might be delayed if there's some progress in negotiations. Simply, this talk discouraged and frightened West Berliners because when they heard of the U.S. willingness to discuss it with anything with East Germany. Now, well before the 1960 presidential election, John Kennedy became aware of the sensitivity of the Berlin question. He told an interviewer in 1959 that Berlin was to be a test of nerve and will. And during the presidential campaign of 1960, the candidates were continuously reminded of the difficult situation in Berlin. JFK elaborated his views on foreign policy during the campaign, on dealing with the Soviets, on dealing his intentions for Berlin, and explained to the American people during the election the real issue of American foreign policy today is the lack of long-range preparation, the lack of policy planning, a coherent and purposeful national strategy backed by strength. He summed up the position I think that he was going to take. Only a militarily strong and powerful United States could negotiate effectively with the Soviet leadership and bring about a long-range solution to the problems of Berlin based on U.S. commitments.